So I'm in Sydney right now at Hyde Park, which is one of the main parks in the city. And I just thought talk a bit more about some of my general observations on Australia during my trip here. Because I'm going to be leaving in a few days, and I've had a lot more time here now than when I made the last video. So there's a lot of observations that I've made since. First and foremost, one thing about Australia that I find kind of interesting is that there's this smell that's everywhere, and I don't know what it is. Like, I looked it up online, the AI said it's probably the smell of eucalyptus trees or something like that. I don't know, but I smell it here in Sydney. I smelled it in the Northern Territory, like in the Red Centre, like where Ayers Rock is and all that stuff. So, like, whatever it is, there's this, like, omnipresent Australian smell. Sometimes I think it's, like, in the water. Like, sometimes I think it's the water that I'm smelling it from. But I don't know what it is, but it's not a bad smell per se, but it's, like, it's distinctive. Like, there's definitely, like, a distinctive Australian smell that exists. So that's one thing. Another thing is that I am relieved to see that, like, the Australian accent very much still does exist, because I was worried that it would be like North America, where, like, you know, all the regional accents, like the Southern accents, the Boswash corridor accents, the Chicago accent, New Orleans accent, whatever, like, all that stuff seems to be, like, dying out, especially among the younger generations. Like, kind of like unironically, like in The Sopranos, with, like, Tony and Carmela have pretty strong Jersey accents, but Meadow and AJ, their kids, hardly do at all. It's pretty much like that in real life there with the different generations. But thankfully here in Australia, no. People of all generations, they still speak very much with the Australian accent, and I'm relieved about that, frankly, because I'm tired of the, like, homogenization of the English language. How everything is starting to sound like this, like, generic North American accent, like, everywhere. And it's like, I'm glad that at least Australia seems somewhat exempt from that. Now, one thing I've noticed here in Sydney, like, it is quite multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, kind of like, it does remind me of a Canadian city in the demographic makeup, like Toronto or Vancouver, in the sense that, like, there's this declining white population that is being kind of supplanted by people predominantly from the Asian continent and also North Africa. So, like, Asian in the broad sense of the word, like East Asia, Indian subcontinent, Middle East, and North Africa. So basically the Oriental world in the broad sense, like the East in the broad sense of the word. However, one thing in Sydney that I've noticed, there's not a ton of race mixing. Like, I'm not seeing a ton of mixed race couples everywhere. Like, most of the younger, like, millennials and Gen Z seem to be in relationships with people of their own race. Like, obviously, of those who are in relationships at all. Like, there's still, I'm sure, plenty of, like, single people, like, forever alone or whatever. But I'm not seeing, like, tons and tons of mixed race couples like you'd see in, like, frankly, not just Toronto, but, like, most major cities in Western countries these days. There's some of it for sure, but it's not, like, constant or everywhere. It doesn't seem to be, anyway, from what I've observed. Like, there's a lot of, like, prototypical, like, Chad and Stacy type couples, which is honestly something I'm seeing less and less of back home, especially in Toronto, but even out of Toronto, like, just in general. Like, I'm seeing less of that sort of thing in Canada lately compared to even when I was younger. But here in Australia, there's still a lot of these, like, you know, kind of prototypical Chad and Stacy, like, young white couples. And I mean, it's a good thing to see, frankly. Like, I mean, it's, like, genetically speaking, yeah. Now the weather's pretty nice here, but granted, this is May, which is their November. Like, it's kind of like May is to Australia as November is in the northern hemisphere. And I mean, yeah, so the weather's pretty nice. Like, it's been pretty nice this whole trip, like, so far. I've enjoyed that aspect quite a bit. So I guess in terms of my impressions of Sydney, I mean, it is a lot like as I mentioned in my previous video, a lot like Toronto in many ways. Like also just the layout, like the way you have this like modernist downtown surrounded by this like more historic area of like predominantly Victorian like row houses and denser homes. And then as you get further out, there's like suburbs, which are like a mix of suburban sprawl, detached homes, and also like condos and stuff. But like I do get the vibe here that like, at least in the residential areas, I think there's a bit more emphasis on historical preservation than in Toronto, because I don't see as many of the renovators like in Toronto. Like in Toronto, there's a lot of these renovators who are just destroying historic homes and either like tearing them down completely or like modifying them with hideous modernist additions and modifications. Whereas here, I don't see that sort of thing quite as much in the residential neighborhood. So that's good. But I will say the downtown here is fairly similar to Toronto in terms of like most of the historic buildings are destroyed. There's still some here and there, but it's like I'd say similar level of preservation overall in the downtown area, but better levels in the areas surrounding downtown, like in the residential areas surrounding downtown. Really in Toronto, the only area that I find is as good as here might be like Cabbagetown and maybe the Annex, but there's a lot of like renovators who are just wreaking havoc across the historic neighborhoods in Toronto, but not so much here in Sydney, so that's a good thing. The historic style of architecture of the residential buildings is kind of interesting because a lot of it is like these sort of like Victorian style, but with like balconies and stuff. I'd say it's kind of a bit reminiscent of like New Orleans in a way, like the sort of wrought iron balconies and stuff like that you see on like the second floors of a lot of these row houses and old homes. Interestingly, from what I've seen on Google Street View, Singapore actually has some similar style like colonial architecture. I'm not sure how much New Zealand has. Like from what I've seen on Google Street View, New Zealand doesn't seem to be like terribly well preserved architecturally. So I don't know. I mean, I get the impression from what I've seen on Street View that like Sydney and Melbourne are the cities with the most historic architecture that still exists, like in this region of like Australia and New Zealand combined. But yeah, I've seen some stuff that looks similar like on Street View in, as I mentioned, in Singapore, but even in South Africa, from what I've seen on Street View, like again, I've never been to any of these other countries I'm talking about here, like Singapore, New Zealand, South Africa. So I'm just saying from like what I've seen on Street View. But from what I've seen on Street View, there is some kind of similar like Victorian era architecture in like Cape Town, for instance, and also, as I mentioned, in Singapore. So yeah, it's interesting how there's like these like kind of like Southern Hemisphere British colonial styles that seem to exist. I guess in the case of Cape Town, it could be British or Dutch, I'm not sure. But it looks similar enough to what you see here from what I've seen, like some of it anyway, in certain specific neighborhoods of Cape Town. But yeah. And incidentally, I guess like the similarity to New Orleans is kind of more coincidental than anything, because I think New Orleans is more built by like the French and Spanish. But I guess there could be certain commonalities to like what is considered like warm weather European colonial architecture, even between like the British and the continental powers. So it's like, it's kind of interesting to see like similar architectural styles across different countries and stuff like that, but from similar time periods. But even though I said there's not a lot of like, I mean, there's not a lot of like mixing and stuff here, but there is a lot of like wokeness in other forms. Because I do notice there's a lot of like land acknowledgements and stuff. Like I see it on websites, I see it in physical places, and I'd say like I see just as much of that here as I do in Canada. Like it's a lot. There definitely seems to be a lot of like graffiti and stickers and posters and stuff that are like, oh, land back for the Aboriginals, etc. Like I see a lot of that sort of thing in Australia, both in the center and also here. And now, interestingly, on that note, okay, I was mentioning in my previous video about how there are certain guidelines at the national parks regarding certain behaviors, like how they want you to like adhere to like the religious beliefs of the local Aboriginal population by not taking photos of the rock formations because it's like against their religion or whatever. But it's not enforced, as I said, as a rule. However, one thing I noticed, okay, a lot of people were taking photos, myself included. Most people didn't seem to care, but I did actually get reprimanded for doing it by one woman. She was not a park employee. She was a tourist, and judging by her accent, like, she was white, probably similar age to me, like 30s or whatever. Judging by her accent, I think she was probably also North American. She could have very well been Canadian, in fact. It wouldn't shock me one bit. And she reprimanded me for taking photos. She's like, oh, excuse me, do you know you're not supposed to take photos here? I'm like, okay, but it's not against the law, is it? And she's like, well, no, but I just wanted to make sure you were aware. Like, fuck off, Karen, you know? Like, that's, like, I don't know. And it's just funny how it's like, I come, like, to the opposite end of the world, and sure enough, the one person who behaves that way is from where I'm from. And on that note, like, I have noticed, like, there's a fair amount of tourists and what people here for whatever reason from North America. Like, I do hear a fair amount of, like, North American accents, so I think there's a fair number here, and also Europeans. But I can't help but wonder if, as I said before, like, a lot of people are here for the same reason I am, which is, at least partly, because so many world events lately are making it harder to travel to certain places. Like, Trump's border controls are making it harder to go to the US, and the jet fuel situation in Europe looks kind of sketchy. So it's like, yeah, here was my kind of logical choice if it's not going to be like US or Europe. So who knows, maybe at least temporarily this might actually have been good for Australia's tourism industry. I don't know. One thing I'll say for Sydney, it feels less sketchy than a lot of cities in Western countries. Like, I don't feel constantly, like, worried about, like, getting shit stolen from me or anything like that. Like, I don't get that vibe here. It's like, it's a general vibe that I just don't get here as much as in other cities. Like, I don't see, like, a lot of, like, intimidating looking, like, groups of young men. I don't see too many, like, screaming like homeless people on drugs or whatever. Like, there's some of that sort of thing here, but I'm not seeing it as much as in, like, US, Canada, or even for that matter most of Western Europe. Like, I would say it feels like there's less of that sort of thing here in Sydney. There's not, like, a lot of Aboriginal people in Sydney. Like, I didn't even see a single Aboriginal person when I was first in Sydney, when I first arrived. I've seen a few since then, but not many. Like, it's kind of similar again to Toronto in that regard, where the Indigenous population is, like, less represented in the large cities. Actually, you could say, I think from what I've seen, that's true in all 5 of the biggest Australian cities, like Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane, Perth. Like, and it's kind of similar to the largest Canadian cities in that regard, like Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, Ottawa, Calgary, Edmonton. Well, not so much Edmonton. Edmonton has a few more, but still, it's a similar pattern, even if Edmonton's a bit of an exception there, like, where the Indigenous population is, like, less represented in the larger cities, like, relative to the country as a whole. Like, what I kind of say in Australia, the whole country gives me a bit of an uncanny valley vibe, because it's similar to Canada in a lot of ways, but yet there are also certain key differences. Like, subtle things, like, say, like, the side of the road they drive on or whatever. And the whole thing, it just gives a bit of, and the fact that, like, the road signs look more like in Europe, but yet at the same time, the rules of the road might be more similar to North America in some ways, or at least, like, the layout of the streets. Like, the fact that there aren't, like, as many, like, narrow streets as in Europe, like in the historic old towns and stuff like that. Yeah, I don't know, like, the whole country just gives me a bit of an uncanny valley vibe, where it's like, it's similar to home, but not exactly. It's kind of like how I describe it as, like, the Sun Belt of the United States, but if it had been founded by Canadians with a funny accent. Kind of like, it's like, weather-wise, it's more like the US Sun Belt, but politically, it's not as, like, it's a bit more liberal, actually considerably more liberal, considerably more socialist. Not super socialist or anything, but like they do get a lot of vacation time here, for instance. But surprisingly not like race mixers everywhere. That's one thing I've noticed. There's not a ton of race mixers. I'm not seeing a ton of like openly LGBT couples either. Like I'm sure there's plenty, but I'm saying it's not like everywhere. Although to be fair, even in Toronto it's not everywhere. Like I find like, I don't know, maybe there is still some stigma because I see way more like openly gay couples like in the gay neighborhood in Toronto compared to even like other parts of the city. But even like thinking about it, like other parts of the city, I'd say I still see fewer here in general. So yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting country how it's like some things that you would associate with like leftism, liberalism are just as prevalent here as in like Canada, for instance, but other things are not. Yeah. I mean, growing up, I kind of always had the stereotype of Australia as being like less liberal than Canada. Like I saw it as kind of like, I don't know, like a bit like Texas or whatever. But I mean, in recent years, like obviously during the big event of 2020, 2021, like they went like further with the restrictions than like almost any other country on the planet. Same with New Zealand. I guess I always saw New Zealand as pretty like left liberal leaning, but Australia not as much. But at the same time, like Australia, like their population is actually pretty heavily urbanized. Like I think more so than Canada or the US. Like I think, I'm not sure about it, but I think the majority of the population might live in the 5 biggest metropolitan areas combined, like Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide. I'm not sure about that, but I think it might be over 50% of the population. I'll have to look that up. But so there is that. And also like I know in the elections like the Labour Party tends to win a lot. And that's the funny thing. Their left party is called Labour, but their alleged like right party is called Liberal. So it's kind of funny how it's like the Conservative Party is called the Liberal Party. Oh my gosh. But yeah, I don't know. But as I've said, like it's interesting. I'll say that. The other thing is that, okay, when people talk about what's dangerous in a country, as with so many other instances, the number one danger that people underestimate is driving, and the number one danger people overestimate is pretty much everything else. So it's like, what were the most dangerous situations I was in here? I'll tell you. None of them involved like crime. None of them involved wild animals. All of them involved driving. I was in a few pretty dangerous situations, and all of them were, well, the only place I was driving was, out in the Northern Territory, which has by far the highest car accident death rate of any state or territory in Australia. I looked that up. It's not even close, actually, and I can see how. Like, it's similar to, like, the North American West in that regard, like the Wild West. Like, a lot of, like, kind of like 2-lane roads with high speed limits, and in a lot of cases, the 2-lane roads, they're not that like wide, and the side of the road is kind of not very well paved, so you kind of have to like go over the center a little bit, like over the line in the middle of the road, and it can be very difficult passing someone. Like I had to pass this massive truck. Like there's like some like Mad Max shit. Like it was like, they call it like a road train. I know it sounds like so much like something from Mad Max, and it was like this like transport truck but with like 3 different like large containers behind it. Like it was ridiculously long, and it says don't pass on curves, or like don't pass when turning, but what they really mean is like don't pass it when the road is anything but like 100% straight. And I almost got like ran off the road while trying to pass it. Yeah, that was not fun. Also, there was another instance where there's these like washouts where it's like for flood control, and there'll be like dirt that'll be on the road in these like washouts. And in one case, there was a lot of dirt on the road, and I could have got like stuck in it easily. I will admit, like I've said a lot against SUV and pickup truck drivers in cities, and I maintain what I said. I actually reserved a sedan at the rental company, but they didn't have one, so they gave me an SUV instead. Like, it was the only option. I will admit, in that one situation, I was grateful to have it, because having a vehicle with lower clearance in that situation would have been pretty potentially bad. Like, there was a lot of dirt in that washout, and even with the SUV, it was still a bit sketchy. Like, it made the vehicle like wobble a bit, but like, if I tried that in a vehicle with a lower clearance, I don't know how that would have gone. It may not have ended too well. I might have gotten like stuck there. But yeah, like I said, like, these types of things, how often is that going to happen in an urban area? How often is that going to happen in like most places? Like, this is the first time in my entire life I've encountered a situation like this. And frankly, like, yes, being in the SUV did, confirm some of my negative biases against them too. Like, the things do guzzle fucking gas. Like, it required a lot of gasoline, and gasoline is not cheap out there. The guzzolane, it's expensive, like in Mad Max. Guzzolane is expensive. Also, the thing's wide as fuck, and it's a pain in the ass sometimes, like, getting into parking spaces and stuff like that. Not to mention on the road, like, it really takes up that entire lane, and you can tell the difference. Like, I really had to watch out about like scraping against the curb and stuff like that because of how wide the vehicle is. So, like, overall, I guess, yeah, I was glad to have it in that one situation, but like, I don't think it, like, there's statistics that like 95% of SUVs are never even, I don't know. Well, that's like, they technically never go off-road, and I guess that was technically not off-road. But like, at the same time, it's like, I feel like the vast majority of people, they just drive these vehicles in like urban or suburban areas, maybe on like the major highways, like the freeways between different cities. And again, I don't anticipate those types of situations happening on those highways as much. Like, it was this like rinky-dink ass highway in kind of the middle of nowhere. It was the highway to go to Kings Canyon National Park. So it wasn't even like the main highway in the Northern Territory, like the main 2-lane highway. It was like some really like sub-level, middle of nowhere highway. But yeah, I mean, I guess I can understand for situations like that, but it's like, does the average person in a major city encounter those situations on a regular basis, or even at all? Probably not. It's like, it's probably just cheaper to like own a sedan and then like rent an SUV for like the rare occasion where you might genuinely need one. Like, way cheaper when you think about it. Like, way cheaper. Not even close. But yeah, I guess those are my thoughts on Australia. I hope this was shit posty enough to be true to the Australian spirit, because like, I wanted to provide some actual observations, but at the same time, in the spirit of Australian nationalism, this has to be a bit shitposty. So yeah, I hope it was sufficiently shitposty enough, and yeah, that's all I got to say about that.